Good afternoon, beautiful people. Welcome to another episode of Kiko's Free Thinkers Forum, episode 35. And we're here with a very special guest this afternoon. Her name is Tina Landis, and she's a founding member of the Party of Liberation and Socialism, PSL. And she also has a book that I read that's called Climate Solutions Beyond Capitalism, which is going to be the meat of the discussion today. But I do have other questions. And she's also a contributor to the Socialist Reconstruction book that was published through the PSL membership. And she has a lot of just work in social justice and advocacy that issues that we all care about on the forum. And so I just want to say welcome, Ms. Tina Landis, to the show, and thanks for accepting our invitation.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yes. And I want to start out, I guess, with my audience, since they don't know who you are. Maybe some people do know who you are, because there are some PSL people, I think, that follow the forum. I know Green Party people do. But how did you kind of get started in environmental activism and climate change? Have you always been a part of this movement?
Yeah, so I got really politically active right after 9/11 and got involved in the anti-war movement and met the Answer Coalition. And then from there, got involved in lots of social justice struggles, and the environmental movement was always part of my life. From a very early age, I was concerned about the environment. So yeah, and then we formed the PSL in 2004, and from there, I really saw the need for socialism to really overcome all the problems that we face in the US and globally, all the contradictions and the poverty and injustices, and the environmental issues as well. So from there, and then I started working in the field. I work in air quality regulation and climate protection, have been doing that for the last 11 years. And then, slowly started to do a lot of self-study around the issue of climate change, and went through a program at UC Berkeley in sustainable management. And just from there, just really built up my knowledge base of the issue, and really saw the shortcomings of a lot of, academia and obviously the mass media, and really saw the need to have a different narrative out there. So I wrote the book Climate Solutions Beyond Capitalism to really look at the problem of climate change beyond the limitations of the system that we live under, and see and really just talk about the tools and the solutions that actually exist, and how they could be implemented under a socialist system.
And I tell you, I don't know if you all read, obviously you have, but when I read it at first, I was a little scared. I mean, because when I read books, I love to read from cover to cover, like everything, like all the credits. I want to know who's behind everything. But at first it started out, I was like, clearly there's an intent to have like an socialist perspective. And it read like a manifesto. It really did at first. And I was when I was like, is it going to be like this the whole book? And I think you did a really good job of driving the point that capitalism holds back basically life as we know it. And the whole purpose is just to generate profits and to just everything else that we know about capitalism, all the downfalls of the late stages that we're in. But it was like a pamphlet driven. I was like, is this come to manifesto meets the PSL? I wasn't sure what to expect. But then when I started reading the data and stuff, I think it kind of lowered my, not concerns, but I guess as a reader, it lowered my possible inhibitions into getting caught up in language. And I don't want to get into the language quite yet, because that's going to be a question towards the end. But I am curious as to where's the PSL and the Green Party? Is there a divergence in ideology when you talk about the environment and climate? If there is one, where is that divergence between the Green Party and PSL, for instance?
Yeah, I mean, we work with the Green Party on a lot of different initiatives. But the Green Party tends to look at the solutions within the system. So more like social democrat positions. So reforms within the system, more social benefits for people, more of a social safety net, and free education, free healthcare, things like that. Like more of the European model, as opposed to a revolutionary socialist position that the PSL has, which is we need to uproot the whole system of capitalism, because every reform that we do win under this system, as soon as the movement ebbs, are taken back, right? You can see that with even with the environmental movement, the EPA was formed due to the mass movement in the 60s and 70s, right? That demanded there be protections for the environment. And slowly, beginning with Reagan, completely started to defund it and slowly whittling away the powers of the EPA, which were never really strong enough to begin with. But, you can see that under capitalism, it's a constant struggle to keep any gains that we do win, and they tend to just be taken back as soon as the powers that be see that the movement is weaker, right? And people won't stand up as they were before. So our party is more, we're looking to completely transform the system, right, into a socialist system that can really use the resources of society to provide the needs of people and the planet, right? Whereas the Green Party is looking more towards reforms. That's my understanding. I mean, I don't follow the Green Party super closely, but we do ally with them on many projects, and have worked with them and do work with them.
Thanks for that clarification, because I kind of thought that all along, but I wasn't 100% sure. I figured I'd ask the person face to face, because the Green Party, even not just nationally and locally, at times it seems like they're almost incrementalist in a way when it comes to, like, it's almost like Democrats who just defected as Democrats and they want to change something up. But the PSL, to me, seems like it has its own unique identity, and there are clear boundaries and differences in principles. And I think the Green Party can be a little bit more loose. So that makes a lot more sense, like, based on what you just said, as far as that's concerned. There's definitely more of a strategic and calculated angle when you talk about the environment, climate, social justice, everything else, which leads me to another question before we get into your book. Where is the climate justice movement? Where does that intersect with the social justice movements, like with Black people, Indigenous people? Because I've always viewed environmental issues, and maybe this is just because of my own fault and upbringing, but I've always been very distanced in a way from environmental and climate issues, because growing up as a Black person in the South, it seems like that becomes almost the center stage. And maybe that is part of the trauma of just the country having to, like, focus on what do we center ourselves around. And for whatever reason, identity is always a big thing for Black people. I'm not going to say for all Black people, but for me especially, it was in my early years growing up. Not so much now because I've learned more politically, but I've always had this struggle with the environmental movement and climate initiatives, almost seem separate from other justice movements. Will you agree with that? And how do we bridge those two together, or make them understand each other a little bit better?
Yeah. So yes, traditionally the environmental movement has been very white, middle class. With others, to some degree, but it tends to be dominated by, and still is very dominated by, the NGOs, which really, in my opinion, is problematic because it doesn't allow for a revolutionary voice. It doesn't allow for a broad range of voices, but there's different, organizing on the local level all around the country, right? So it's shifting now, I feel like, especially since the sort of uprising of Standing Rock and the Indigenous movement really coming to the forefront of fighting against, extractivism and for environmental protections and against climate change. So the movement has become more diverse, I feel, in the last, decade, maybe. But there needs to be more of that, right? There needs to be more connecting the dots, right? Between the local struggles, between all the struggles we face, the struggle against police brutality. We're struggling against capitalism there too, right? We're struggling against this dominant, white supremacist system, right? That divides us and oppresses certain communities, right? And it's the same system that's destroying our planet, right? That's just going around the world, just like extracting everything, sees everything as a commodity, and keeps us divided, right? So the PSL really sees we need a multinational working class movement, a working class organization that's unified across race, across class, or well, not necessarily class, but across borders, to really if we're not unified, if we're not working on, broadly on all these struggles that all stem from the system of capitalism, we won't overcome it, right? We can't just fight, LGBT people fighting on their struggle and others, women's fighting on, issues of sexism. We all need to fight together to overcome these issues. So yeah, we need to do that with the climate justice movement. We need to broaden it. It's everyone's issue, right? It's like we all are facing the impacts of climate change. Of course, it impacts the poor and the working class the most globally. But yeah, it's really important to bring in all those voices and struggle on the local issues, because all around the country, it's the communities of color, it's the low-income communities that face the worst pollution, that have the industries in their backyards, the freeways in their backyards, and are facing the real health impacts of environmental pollution. So yeah, we need to make those connections and build those bridges. Sure.
Absolutely. And as far as your book is concerned, how does that work with your book, Climate Solutions Beyond Capitalism? Is that something that's published independently of Liberation School? Like this Corpus Liberation School, is that through PSL? And is all the publication done through Liberation School?
Liberation Media, yeah, we reproduce our own, publications, usually written by our members, but sometimes, in partnership with others who are not members. So yeah, so my book is published through that Liberation Media. It's available on Amazon as well. But yeah, and I really wrote it because I saw within the activist community, even so many folks had so much anxiety about climate change and didn't understand that there are actually solutions that exist. And it was really hard to even have a discussion about it because, and I get it, like before I knew there were solutions, I also was like, even though I cared about the environment, I had a lot of anxiety just thinking about climate change. So I really felt it was important to write something for the activists who want this change, but don't necessarily have all the information, and to really write. And that's why it was concise as well, is like just to give a few examples that people could then delve deeper into, right? It's really well referenced, so people can go back and learn more about all the things I talk about, but to really give an overview that the tools exist, we know what to do, we know what needs to happen, and how capitalism has brought us to this situation in the first place, but that it is possible to make this change.
That was the scary part about your book, was your book has so much factual information that it's scary, honestly, because I believe the solutions, I mean, that's a perfect way to include it in the title. Unfortunately, I believe the capitalists already know the solutions. They know that we can go to a green sustainability system under a socialist, society. They already know that, I feel. And so to me, it seems like greed is keeping this thing held back. Because I think capitalism, if it does anything, it definitely encourages people to strive for things, but not considering other people. Like it's just like a dog eat dog type mentality. And regardless of whatever the consequences happen, hey, you got to survive on your own. You have to do it on your own. And I think we become so complacent, and that complacency has led us to where we are right now, because there's definitely resistance within this system, but I think there's so much complacency too. And this book definitely urges us to kind of like get rid of this comatized state that we're in of complacency with just all the data, the urgency. According to the book, there's a rise of global temperatures 45 degrees Celsius. And you're saying that if we follow some of the advice of this book, that we can lower that to 1.5 Celsius.
Yeah, I mean, studies show, we could actually reverse climate change within just one generation if we had major transformations of how we live on the planet, right? But we have the knowledge, we have the tools, but yeah, the system of capitalism really, I mean, the way the system is set up, you can't plan long term, right? It's like corporations plan for the next quarter, how much how many profits how can they increase their profits for the next quarter, right? And government has, very little power to implement any changes. It has to be within partnership, these public-private partnerships, right? Can provide incentives or tax corporations for doing certain things wrong or whatever, but it doesn't have the power to make sweeping transformations in society. Like, for instance, implementing renewable energy from coast to coast, right? It's because the oil companies have to go along with it, right? And the power companies have to go along with it, which are all privately owned or for the most part. Yeah, and just the nature of capitalism, it requires endless growth. It's part of the system, right? And it it's up to the free market to provide what we need to live, right? Which is not a good plan. And even if one capitalist, one CEO of one company wanted to truly be environmentally sustainable, right? They would be replaced by another CEO that didn't prioritize that, because it really is not profitable, right? You'd have to not be seeking out those profits. You'd have to scale back your production. You'd have to, do everything, in a sustainable way, which costs more. So yeah, the system itself is holding us back as a species, right? It's holding back humanity from actually overcoming all these problems that we're facing with climate change, which, ripples out into many things, right? Health, public health, hunger, all these, other impacts, right? Displacement of people, the refugee crisis all around the world that's related to climate change. It's so many things ripple out into society that all stem from that. And yeah, capitalism really can't solve it, because it's really the cause of the problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it encourages, like you said very well in the book, this idea of greenwashing everything. I thought about just simple things like recycling, and how that has become just they emphasize things so hard, but they're very small in the gist of everything, and that's kind of what your book drives the point is the sea levels and the rainforest and everything else is more than just individual. This is a systemic thing that has to change. It's not the poor person down the street or even the rich person down the street that's causing the heating of the earth. Like, that stuff can be reversed if this whole system changes. And going into that, what would be, I guess, some of the most important points in your book, if you're telling someone who hasn't read it, like, what would be some of the immediate things that your book addresses to, I guess, convince someone that's a little bit more skeptical?
Yeah. So you mean skeptical that climate change is a problem, or skeptical of it?
Mm-hmm.
I really think that most people at this point aren't like climate change deniers. I think those that do exist are tied to fossil fuel corporations in some way. Some way, somehow in their personal interest to deny that this is a problem. I mean, we see everywhere around the globe, the extreme weather that's happening. You have to really be blind to the world around you to not realize what's happening. But the problem of, 98% of mainstream media stories about climate change only focus on the problem, right? The unraveling of our climate. And they never talk about solutions in a real way. Other than maybe like, oh, this corporation's making, electric vehicles, which is not, the solution. So people don't have the knowledge, right? They don't understand that there are solutions. Another study shows that despite, increasing awareness and concern in the US population about climate change, only 5% of people think there's anything we can do about it. So
wow.
I feel like it's, like why it's so important to like talk about these issues and really talk about the solutions, because if people don't know there are solutions, they're not going to stand up and demand action, which is what we need, right? We need another big mass movement, right? We need a mass radicalization of the population that sees we the people do have the power to make the change. and that if when we organize, we can actually get concessions from our government like we have in the past, and that in the end we are the ones who have the power and the knowledge to implement the changes that are needed, and we just need to do it, right? And yeah, so yeah, I don't think denialism is really a widespread issue. It's really a lack of hope and a lack of understanding that we can actually turn it around. Which is why I try to speak on this issue as much as possible, and support others who are speaking about the solutions, because that's really how we're going to shift things. But unfortunately, 6 major corporations own all the mainstream media. It's really hard to get any other message out beyond that, other than through great podcasts like yours and others.
Yes, I'm going to read a few stats out here, and I was thinking about something when you talked about this planned economy, this idea of a planned economy. I think, and that'll go to something that I have towards the end about the language, because I think people get so caught up in these terms like socialism and communism and capitalism, and that's what I liked about the book, is that it gives you solutions, and regardless of what your ideology is. This is telling you this is a solvable issue. There's no excuses, really. I think what gets to people is it bothers their conscience, because this is tied to the political system, unfortunately. Like, I kept reading your book, and towards the end, there's nothing that you could really argue as far as the evidence that you presented. But it's a matter of people, their whole political ideology would have to change, I feel. And I don't care what spectrum you're on, because we're so captured by the same system you mentioned several times. It is basically programmed us into becoming black, white, binary solution type people. Like, everything, if you're not with me, you're against me. If this doesn't work, that means nothing can work. Like, that's basically the way it's kind of trained us to be. And the war machine is really what I thought about too. Just we know that the military is the largest polluter on the planet, and I don't know what you said about the Navy, about how much they just dispose in the ocean, just like casually. And but it's one of those issues now where there's a lot of anti-war sentiment. But as you mentioned, the mainstream media is covering for those military contractors because they're in partnership together. The fossil fuel industry is in partnership with these media corporations. So, and that's the tough part, is the lobbying that you mentioned. It goes back to politics again. All these politicians are tied to lobbyists, and these lobbyists are tied to the corporations, and they're basically bought at that point once they get into office. So it doesn't matter if they say that they're progressive or conservative or whatever they want to call themselves. They're basically all the same once they're compromised by these huge CEOs of these companies. I mean, that's what it seems like happening.
Yeah, and in the US, it's like the political narrative is so tightly controlled, right? We don't have a parliamentary system like other countries have, where there's a wide array of voices, right, from the left and towards the right. But where really you could have, in Europe, the PSL would have seats in parliament. I mean, we're big enough. So people would be hearing different positions. In the US, it's like you hear 2 corporate parties. You hear basically slightly more to the right and more to, slightly more for the center right at this point. And it's really, these are our so-called representatives are multimillionaires, and yes, they are backed by the corporations. Biden had the 2nd largest campaign donations from fossil fuel corporations in 2020. Yeah, he was the climate president. It's great changes, right? But they're all, it's like, yeah, there's just no room for a different narrative, so people don't hear, which so especially I feel like younger people are way more open to socialism, and they're not freaked out by the word socialism anymore, especially since Sanders. It's more the older folks who grew up during the Cold War period and just had it hammered into their brain that communism is evil and capitalism is the only way forward and blah, blah, blah. So yeah, we have something to overcome with that issue of people just not understanding what socialism really is. But like I said, younger people by far are way more open. And they do understand the basics, at least, that, hey, yeah, because they see like there's no future, right? It's like you're in student debt forever, you can't pay for healthcare, you can't get a decent job, like all these things, because capitalism is not is not working for the majority of us. But yeah, it's and the military, talking about the military, it's like there's these UN climate summits all, every year, and imperialism is never talked about, right? The military, the US doesn't have to report emissions from the military in these summits, right? It's like the elephant in the room, like it's just never talked about, even though the Pentagon is the largest consumer of fossil fuels on the planet. And will never be green, I'm sorry. And the whole system of imperialism, right, that just keeps countries from developing independently, keeps them from indebted to the global north. All these IMF austerity loans and the trade deals that always benefit the global north and keep the global south impoverished, and really unable to develop in a green, with clean energy and all these things, right? And not to mention the wars and the interventions and the coups and all these things that the U.S. implements around the world, that just keeps us all divided and unable to actually develop on a sustainable path globally. But yeah, and yeah, the U.S. is a huge polluter. All the bases around the world, over 800 bases, they're all end up being toxic sites. The burn pits in Iraq, where they just literally burned everything. They covered it in jet fuel and just burned it, and now the vets are paying for it with horrible lung conditions and cancer, not to mention the local people in those countries. But yeah, in the US, the bomb testing they do like off the coast of Florida every year, that just destroys so much marine life and causes so much pollution. Just everything they do, and they get away with it because they say, oh, it's for national security, right? Which is just complete lies. Yeah, they can pollute wherever they want, without any repercussions. Regulations don't apply to the military, literally. And you can see it, on native lands in New Mexico, where the uranium mining starts, the whole process of nuclear weapons and all these things. Like it impacts our communities here too, right? But yeah, without like a global system of cooperation, like there's no way we can ever overcome climate change. We need the opposite of what imperialism and capitalism does, which is to pit countries against each other, right? As competitors. We need the opposite of that. We need global cooperation to really, to help the global South develop in a sustainable path, pay reparations for the legacy of colonialism and imperialism. To really help everyone develop on a sustainable path. And that's totally possible. In the US, we spend, the government spends nearly $1 trillion a year on the war machine, which mainly goes to the weapons manufacturers, right? So the money is there, not to mention also the bank bailouts that continue to happen. Like there's always money for corporate bailouts, there's always money for the war machine, but there's never money to pay to help the global South develop, or to even help communities here in the US, right? So all these factors really play into the situation. And yeah, like you mentioned, the socialist planned economy. Under socialism, you look at what's needed for the next, usually it's like a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan. Cuba actually has a 100-year plan for climate change adaptation. So they're looking like the next century, what do we need to do to protect our country, to address sea level rise and drought and all these things, and for the well-being of their population. But under capitalism, you can't do that, right? There's no planning. It's like it's more a reactive system. It's like when some major crisis happens, it's like, okay, what are we going to do to just prop it up a little longer so it can still function, so we can still exploit the workers and get our profits. But there's never any long-term planning that's really has any holistic perspective on the problem. Speaking from California, where we got a lot of rainfall this year, but we're still in this 20-year mega drought, and there's really no plan of how to overcome that. even though it's pretty simple. It's like 80% of our water resources goes to industrial agriculture. Like, okay, so how do we make agriculture better, right? How do we reduce water needs? I mean, it's pretty simple. Stop growing things that shouldn't be grown in this climate. Move to agroecological methods, which can reduce or greatly reduce or completely eliminate the need for irrigation and recharge the aquifer. There's just so many things that can be done, but capitalism just can't think that far ahead, right? And it can't like think holistically, and it doesn't have the resources. The government doesn't have the resources to actually implement or the power to implement the things that are actually needed, because it would involve land use, it would involve control over big agribusiness, it would involve like having possibly to relocate people to different areas in an equitable way, right? And retraining workers in different jobs for free, right? Because it shouldn't be on the workers to have to find the funds. We're all already strapped. Yeah, so socialism, we need a planned economy. We need a planned economy, which totally makes sense. It's rational, right? You look at what resources you have, you look at what needs to happen. You have the most qualified workers and communities who are really on the ground, understanding the issues, involved in the decision making. We just have, it's so far from that under capitalism, especially in the US. We get to vote every 2 or 4 years, but we never get a say in actual things that are good for our survival.
There's so much going on. Just it's hard when you're outside of the political system, I guess, what we're describing. You already talked about the corporatocracy that we're under. Like, really, just it's the same parties, the way I've always viewed the two. Especially, I'd say the last 5 years, I came to that conclusion that both parties collude, they work together, they're just different colors, and they have to have each other to survive. Because if they didn't have each other, people would start to look outside of that. And there are options outside of the monopoly. Really, what it is the monopoly. But I was thinking about some of my libertarian friends, and I do identify as a libertarian, but not. I identify as a left libertarian, and I think I've talked to some people. I think I'm starting to get it through, because a lot of libertarians are against war too, for different reasons. But I think regardless of the reasons, that can open up something to where they can be more receptive to other messaging. And I think the part where you talk about that planned economy is really important, because to me, that sounds very libertarian in a sense. When you talk about economics, if you talk about the Federal Reserve, those same people argue we got to stop printing money. We have to do this and plan the economy. Okay, so this is another type of planned economy. We're just talking about the environment and climate. So I think if people are more receptive and open their minds up a little bit more, they can see that these ideas that have been basically meant to be viewed as just so like unrealistic or utopian. You mentioned that a lot in there. They're not really utopian. They've just been propagandized to the point where we think that that's unrealistic because of the people who are trying to sell that message.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and what's unrealistic is that we can overcome any of these issues that we're facing with the system of capitalism. Like, just hoping that the billionaire class has and will help us out. I mean, it's really that's truly utopian. I mean, it needs to shift, and yeah, we all know what needs to happen in our local areas, like the people on the ground, dealing with the issues of climate and all the other ills of capitalism. But we need the power, right? But unfortunately, the power is in the hands of these, handful of billionaires. But really, when we organize, we have the power. When we have the resources, we can make it happen. But but we need a plan, and we need to get rid of this chaotic system that we live under.
I was really interested in the part where you talk about water, wind, and solar, I think, and you use that as kind of like that should be the direction, and you debunk kind of this whole talk of nuclear energy. I've heard so much talk about nuclear energy lately, about how that's the solution, how it doesn't use all the carbon and all this stuff. Can you kind of explain why wind, water, and solar is a better alternative than people talking about nuclear?
Yeah, so I mean, now wind and solar are by far the lowest cost way to produce energy and zero emission, right? And there's even ways, that the wind turbine blades and solar panels are being recycled and the batteries are being recycled. And so there's openings for there to be even less waste from that system as well. And yeah, so wind, water, and solar are definitely we have the technology to make the shift globally and still meet the world's energy needs just with wind, water, and solar. Unfortunately, the nuclear lobby is very strong. The nuclear industry is very strong. It has a lot of power in government. It's heavily subsidized by the government, but has, the embedded emissions of a nuclear plant are third highest next to scrub coal fire plants and natural gas, which means like from start to finish, right? So building the plant, because so much concrete goes into building a nuclear plant, which has huge greenhouse gas emissions. And the World Nuclear Association had this proposal for building 1,000 new nuclear plants by 2050 as a way to address climate change. But even that would only reduce carbon emissions by 10% if we built 1,000, which would be like building one new nuclear plant every 12 days or something insane. Nuclear plants take at least a decade to build. Like, we don't have the time for that, right? We can roll out wind, especially wind and solar, really quickly because we have less than a decade to really address this, to keep the warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius above industrial era levels. So we need to move quickly, and nuclear is not it. And there's also the issue of catastrophic reactor failure. There's the issue of radioactive waste, which is, always dumped in, on native land or in poor communities. And it lasts for 10,000 years. It's like, how can we keep building these plants and using nuclear energy when there's no way to deal with the waste in a safe way? So it's definitely not the way to go. It's definitely not like I said, the embedded emissions. It's not really a clean form of energy. But yeah, so wind, water, solar, and shifting to publicly controlled utilities, publicly controlled energy systems, more localized microgrids that are connected to neighboring grids, so it could really have a more climate resilient system. So we can see what happens with these big grid failures, like what happened in Texas a few years ago, where people froze to death in their homes. I mean, it's not, the current U.S. grid is not climate resilient, and it's in many areas on the brink of collapse when we have these crazy storms and extreme weather. There's lots of studies that show that model these systems and show that this transition is totally possible, like right now with the technology that we have to shift to wind, water, and solar.
How would you rate, and this would be a curious question for people, because I'm located in the South, I'm in Middle Tennessee. There's a perception in Tennessee amongst people, I just call it that. And people are leaving California like quite often, from the West to areas like Nashville, Atlanta. These cities are becoming very populated. How would you rate San Francisco as a whole when you talk about the environment? Because the perception is that people out West are they do everything's about the environment. Like, that's the perception from a Southerner. We just call them Southerners for lack of a better term. That's what a typical Southerner would say. And how would you describe your own environment, and I guess debunking some of those misconceptions that people in different geographic regions may have of people in California, for instance?
Yeah, so California does have stricter environmental regulations than most other states, as far as like vehicle emissions and just different industry emissions, air pollution. But that said, it's still not nearly enough. And the solutions that are, there's a big push for really, expanding electric vehicle adoption and all these things, which
Mm-hmm.
in my opinion, I mean, and others' opinion, we need to move away from individual car ownership. We need zero emission mass transit that's accessible and goes everywhere. I mean, California, we're building this high speed rail that will go from San Francisco. Well, it's supposed to go from San Francisco to LA. That can't even happen, right? There's so much pushback. Nationally, we need a high speed rail system. I mean, most of the world has that, right? Which would reduce emissions. People wouldn't fly across the country. They could take high-speed train, across the country that wouldn't have any emissions. So yeah, there's a lot of perception that, I mean, because the bar is so low, right, on environmental protections, California is doing more, but it has a long way to go, and there's a lot of contradictions, and it still relies on industry to make it happen, right? It relies on these public-private partnerships. To build out the electric vehicle charging systems through the state and all these things. And, but it's not enough. Like I said, with the drought, there's like a Sustainable Water Act that was passed in, I'm misnaming that, but I think it's Sustainable Groundwater Act that was passed in like 2014, but there's really it sounds great, right? Address the drought. There's no actual plan of how to do that, because it's up to like individual municipalities or land managers or these other entities to make it happen without really support or an overarching plan of how to make it happen. So yeah, it's sort of the same story in California. It's just, people tend to be a little more aware of environmental issues, but it still has a long way to go. And the wildfires too, it's like over a century of fire suppression and not implementing controlled burns to get rid of all the fuel that builds up. And now we see where we're at with these mega wildfires. They're just decimating whole communities. And that came from the Forest Service wanting to protect the trees so they could sell it as timber, and also like to separate the native populations from their traditional culture and land management practices, which was, every few years doing controlled burns on their lands because they saw you don't do that every few years, you're going to have these massive uncontrolled wildfires. So, how do you play? It's like we're playing catch up. There's some funding that's going to that, to implementing controlled burns throughout the state, but it's like, how do you deal with this fuel buildup from over a century? It's really without serious funding and serious, huge numbers of people employed to do it, right? It's just not enough what's happening.
I asked that question because, first of all, I appreciate that perspective, but I knew you would understand it because we talked about capitalism and we all live under it, but there are different gradients of it depending on where you are. And I think that the ironic part of this discussion, when we talk about comparing areas and perceptions and everything else, is that the people who claim to be the most conservative people tend to live in the most socialistic, friendly environments, which I think is just funny. And I think a lot of it's just a language thing. I think a lot of people are living socialistically without even realizing it. Because I've been to some of these places and they have like the wind energy, the solar energy. They believe in community farming. I'm saying to myself, but you're calling people in California this and that, when actually, if anything, the skyrocketing rents and everything else and all the unnecessary energy used, to me, that's not the correct portrayal whatsoever. You're actually making a different argument. You're making an argument for socialism. And in a way, you're living under it in a way and not even, misnaming it, whatever, because of all this propaganda, and everyone's in their own closed-minded, I guess, circles of people. You hang out with your 20 group of people that think the same way, but that can be further from the truth, the narratives and the realities that the people actually live.
Yeah, and California is a very pro-capitalist state. We have more billionaires in the Bay Area than any other part of the country. It's very much about, big business making profits, while, looking green or, doing certain things that, appear to be progressive. Because the history of the state too, the population tended to be more radical, in the 60s and 70s, and really, like I said, any concessions we get from the corporations is because of the population pushing for it. But it doesn't mean that California is socialist by any means. It's very, very capitalistic.
Mm-hmm. You address something in your book that's interesting. I'm actually going to have one of my good friends from high school come on. He was on episode 3, Ben Sedegapar, and he talked a little bit about AI in episode 3. But I'm curious to hear your views because you mentioned how AI could actually help in a sustainable socialistic society in the future. Like you mentioned that in the book. Um, how would that work with artificial intelligence being implemented in this new eco-socialist society?
Yeah, I think that was actually from the Socialist Reconstruction book.
Okay. I
My
thought I
book,
read something in Climate too about the Climate Solutions.
yeah, I think I talked about, yeah, I mean, AI, the development of AI under capitalism and automation in general means more destitution for the working class, right? It means more layoffs. It means lower wages. There's going to be even more is coming, right, of layoffs because of development of AI, because the corporate owners much prefer having automation than actual workers that they have to pay or give healthcare benefits to, or deal with pesky unions or anything like that, right? So it's in their interest to in the goal of maximizing their profits to get rid of workers and move towards automation. But under socialism, what it would mean is more free time for all of us, right? We would all have the benefits of that, right? We would all, have to work less, have to do less because of the automation, and still live full lives with all the things we need under socialism. But under capitalism, it spells destitution for large portions of the working class, which you can see is already happening, but it's going to speed up, unfortunately, until the workers rise up and make it on a different trajectory, right? But yeah, it can be a beneficial thing, right? But under capitalism, it's not, and yeah, it's a different story.
Yeah, I could see, but it wouldn't work unless we transition into that society that you talked about in the book, because AI, if anything, is just going to cause it just capitalism to accelerate more, for sure. Like I totally
Yeah.
agree. But I felt like that when I was reading that, I was like, maybe it could work, but who would be controlling the AI? That's the issue. If the workers are controlling it, I guess it really doesn't matter. At
Yeah.
that point, how good the technology, the efficiency of it is. Because that's the argument that my friend's probably going to make when he comes on, is how AI could actually help us have more family time and free time and stuff. So maybe
Mm-hmm.
we're speaking a similar language. We just have different ways of getting there. I don't know, but it's interesting because it seems like that's an inevitable development. I mean, we already have automation. It's just
Yeah.
the scale isn't as big as it could be. But like you said before, this obsession with green cars and electric cars, I don't think people are really thinking at all when they see these ideas. I mean, it's still selling capitalism. You just have a green label on it. and
Exactly.
capitalism has done that just with and I, and this is not to degrade anyone's identities or anything, but just the the emphasis of these banners, just the over labeling of things, putting the rainbow flag on Chevron oil, putting, I mean, just like all this stuff. I'm just like, are you kidding me? They're basically exploiting that message is what they're doing. Like, just because you put something on it doesn't, you're still covering up the same system. It's still the same system. I mean,
Yes, absolutely.
man, people are like, "Are you kidding me, Kiko? What are you complaining about?" I'm like, "Do you not see that? How
It's marketing. It's all
it's
marketing.
marketing."
The pink fighter jets they have for like breast cancer awareness month, and the what was it, the police cruiser that was, they rolled out for Black History Month. I mean, it's sick. It's a sick.
Ridiculous. It's like some deranged fairy tale.
Yeah, and the big oil companies are spending a lot of money, and they always have, on marketing to pretend, to put out this false perception that they're doing something about, even though their entire existence is the problem, right? And a lot of these companies, the big oil companies, knew in as early as the 1950s that their products were causing global warming, and they did everything in their power to cover that up, to spread disinformation, to block, any shifts towards renewables. And they still do to this day. And then they put out their ads that are all happy and green, and try to convince us all that they're doing good.
What is the hardest part when you present this book to people who may not be on the same page with your views? Um, is the hardest part selling that climate change is a possibility, or that the way you want to change the climate under a socialistic system? Which one seems to be giving you the most pushback, if any at all?
Yeah, I haven't really gotten a lot of pushback. I did a 33, 34 city speaking tour this past year, and really reached a lot of people all over the country, and have done lots of these interviews too. But yeah, I haven't gotten a lot of pushback. I think the biggest thing is like, how can we actually make it happen, in the sense of how can the workers take control, right? How can we have this big transformation of our economy into socialism? Which is possible. I mean, it's totally possible. Like in the past, it's happened in other countries where revolutions have happened, and state power has gone to the workers, and big concessions can also be made. We won a lot of concessions from the ruling class here in the 30s. I mean, there was a very, very strong union, movement in the country, and general strikes, and more class consciousness in the population in general. But big gains can be made. I mean, it has happened before, and you don't know what will spark an uprising of the people, right? We've seen it, just in the last few years, the George Floyd murder. Millions of people around the country came out, some for the very first time in their lives, were in the streets demanding, that this not go on anymore. So you don't know what will bring people into action, but when they are in action, great changes can happen. So I feel like that's the biggest thing, is like just, shifting this knowledge, this hope that and the possibility of implementing these solutions into actually, manifesting and happening.
Yes, and that's something that we've talked about on the forum before. Episode 18, Jake Carrico and Jacob, we talked a lot about theory, Marxism, and stuff. But I think that the way we message things has a lot to do with the way it's received too. And I think now, and I urge my listeners, that sometimes we have to really put our political differences aside, and because we have to optimize who we can reach to. We may not be able to reach everybody, but by at least extending dialogue, we can reach more people that way. And I've been surprised myself the last 3 years, and I've told my wife this. I would not have started this a couple of years ago, because something just kept me a little bit more resistant from reaching out to different people. Even though I was kind of sick of the system, I was still holding a grudge in a way towards other working class people, even though we were very different types of working class people. And so I guess that would be my message, is that sometimes we have to put differences aside to give opposition a chance to see if it's good opposition or not. Because I don't think all opposition is bad. I just don't think that we've connected all the way yet. And sometimes it may not work out, but at least you gave it a shot. And I don't know if we're really giving ourselves a shot right now, because the messaging is to divide everybody. I've seen an increase in the division even more after COVID. it seems like it's gotten even worse. Everything that's used now is almost a tool to just keep the people fragmented even more. Like, and I would urge that to people to just really stop condemning people that are next door to you so quickly, and just understand that they're going to have their baggage just like you do. You're going to have your baggage coming in, but we have to find a way to connect better with people, and stop all this shooting down people in your own class. I mean, I don't understand it, but I understand that capitalism is working and the messaging is working for the capitalist system.
Yeah, and I find when you really just talk to people, even if they're aren't leftists even, or they vote Republican or whatever, when you actually talk to people about the issues in a simple way, like, we all need clean air, we all need clean water, we all need a livable planet, we all, all these things, right? We'd all deserve a living wage and healthcare. And, why should we, why should students be indebted forever for getting an education that will benefit the corporation that they work for later, right? It's like, when you just talk about it in simple terms, like, you can win people over, and you find that you actually agree when it comes down to it on the actual issues. But yes, the media, the government, everyone, the system itself tries. That's their main tool, right? And it has been from the very beginning, is to keep us all divided and fighting each other and blaming each other for the problems that we face, when it's really, we should be looking to the top and blaming them, because they're the ones who are hoarding all the wealth and only throwing us crumbs when we do stand up and demand it.
When you visit, because I know you've been to different countries, and you talk about that some in the book, just obviously you got so much knowledge going visiting these places as far as how they're creating sustainable societies. You talked about how China is crazy, a country as big as China is, with so many people in it, but yet you can't even compare the United States to countries like China, even when you talk about how much emissions we have and just how much damage we do to the climate. Can you kind of go into debunking that? Because that's something to me that would be immediate to someone. Well, how can you do that? But yet a country that big is doing it, but we can't do it.
Right. It goes back to the system, right? Yeah. So the U.S. has historically the largest contributions of greenhouse gas emissions, starting from the Industrial Revolution on. So the largest cumulative emissions, it's responsible for 27% of global greenhouse gas emissions since the Industrial Revolution. The U.S. is, and even today, per capita, the emissions from the U.S. are the highest, right? Because so much is wasted because of the level of development and the corporations. I mean, one of the statistics I have in my book is 100 corporations are responsible for 71% of global greenhouse gas emissions since 1988, I believe. So it really goes back to these companies, right? And China, even though they have a lot of emissions, they're a huge country, but per capita they don't. Per capita their footprint is way lower than the U.S. And it's a socialist government, so they can plan. They have a planned economy, so they're able to implement these big, shifts. They're the largest producer of electric buses globally. Also, their high-speed rail systems are renowned. I mean, it's like 32,000 miles of high-speed rail lines, and they're planning to double that number in the next decade. And they're building these eco-cities, like 250 eco-cities within China. 30, I believe it's 30 of those are what they're calling sponge cities, which really are able to address drought and flooding by creating these wetlands within the cities and these places for rainfall to actually be captured and go into the aquifer and be stored for later when there's drought. They had major reductions in particulate matter pollution in the Beijing area. Within just 4 years, reduced the emissions by 35%. and that particulate matter comes from burning of fossil fuels mainly. And that's, I work in air quality regulation here in the Bay Area. And if we saw a 0.5% reduction of a pollutant in a 4-year period, we'd be celebrating. So like 35% reduction really shows that what can happen when government actually has control over industry, right? Can determine how, what's happening on the ground, and transportation as well. It's a big factor. So yeah, China is able to make these big transformations and really, but they're also, we have to remember, they're still a developing country. They had their revolution in 1949 and came from a very underdeveloped state, and just in a few decades, these last few decades have really developed their capacity, their production, their, built major cities and things like that, and really brought up the population. Just in 2020, they only in 2020 alleviated extreme poverty in the country and brought, I think it's 850 million people out of extreme poverty through this mass, they mobilized the entire population to make this happen, right? So they sent people out into these rural areas to really look at who's suffering, what can we do? What are the hardships these people are facing, and really lift people up. And work in community to do that. And that's so not what happens here in the US, right? It's like we're so disconnected from each other, and community isn't mobilized, which is what needs to happen, right? When you want big shifts to happen in society, you need to mobilize the population to make it happen, and have everyone play a part in that. So in a socialist country like China, they're able to do that. They're really, they have the tools at hand. They have a planned economy. They have the resources of society. They have control over industry. So they're able to make these major shifts that are happening. And their Belt and Road Initiative too. It's the corporate media, calls them imperialists and blah, blah, blah. But what they're really doing, it's actually these, south to south partnerships, these partnerships across the global south with developing countries and China, to really build up infrastructure, which was the opposite of what the colonizers did, which was just any infrastructure they built was to extract the resources and steal them from countries, right? But the Belt and Road is really, building trains, building power systems, building, things that people actually need in the country, and employing local people to do it as well, working in true partnership, with no strings attached, unlike what the imperialists do when they go to different countries, right? So it is a big difference, and it's hard to. I personally have not been to China. I would love to go, actually, but since COVID, it's very hard to go without having to quarantine for a long time and things like that. But it's a big difference. I've been to Cuba a number of times. I mean, even there, you see what they can implement with. I mean, they've lived under a 60+ year US stranglehold blockade, with very limited resources because of that, but they're able to do so much with the resources they do have. They developed one of their first agroecological farming systems, in the early 90s, and have very developed farming system that really works with nature. They also, like I said, they have this 100-year plan for climate change adaptation. They just have a very conservation-minded mindset, and they always have, from very early on. They protect their forests, and they have a big reforestation program because the colonizers chopped all the forests down and planted sugarcane, and so they're trying to restore those areas as well. So you can see with Cuba and China what can really happen when the workers are in control, right? And have the resources in their hands to really to put the well-being of their populations first, as well as really the well-being of the world's populations, people and the planet first, as opposed to a handful of billionaires' profits, right?
Yes, I read your book for sure. Like I was telling the audience at the very beginning, I read it, and I definitely took it to heart when it said it was an eco-socialist perspective, and almost like a manifesto. And I took the climate information to heart more because I didn't know as much about that information. But there's just so much stuff, and I would definitely link the information in the description so the audience has access to this book. Um, you talk about immediate decarbonization, and you say that 4.7 billion acres on 5 continents were reforested. If they could be reforested with native species, and that could store 2/3 of the carbon emitted since the Industrial Revolution. I mean, stuff like that. And then you talked about 90% of plastics will be made from kelp.
Mhm.
These are solutions. I mean, they're in the book. I mean, and that's why I say it's not an exaggeration, the title of the book, because I had never honestly researched that stuff before. And it's good to just have a book or a manual to basically tell you, hey, these are the ways that you can implement um, and get to this society, this climatic change that we need. Literally, a climatic change is what we need. But I was thinking of something else, the politics of it. I always had to go back to politics at the end though, because this is conducive only if the system changes. And to me, I thought of the war crisis that we're in. So that's an immediate thing. I think that's an immediate topic that we could really, I guess, drive home. And then dismantling the political system that we have. I think that in order for this society to happen, we have to dismantle the political system that we have now. And it's not just economics either, it's ideology that we have to dismantle. And that to me, that's the hardest part, I think, in I guess the end goal of the message. Is it utopian? I don't know. I don't know if it is or not. I'm still undecided. That's why I call this the Free Thinkers Forum, Kiko's Free Thinkers Forum, because it's always open to interpretation. I don't think these ideas are utopian. I don't think the ideas are utopian at all. Um, will everyone get on the same page, or will most people get on the same page? I think that's the part that I'm struggling with. Just because friends that I grew up with, it seems like they're becoming more complacent over time, and they're questioning things less. It seems like there's the opposite is going on when I feel like things should be questioned more. And I feel like society now is just so dumbed down with the technology, and it's like the internet has been used in a way to where we've escaped almost in our own rabbit holes, and that's what scares me the most. Because when I was growing up, it was pretty much all we had was encyclopedias, and the internet really wasn't a thing yet. And so your mind could still expand and you could be more open to things. And I think now it's almost too open and people just fall in the crevices.
Yeah, I mean, that speaks to why we need to be organizing in our communities, right? Because when you actually connect with people, and work together in struggle, it can be any issue, right? Whatever the biggest issue in your community is, right? But you then see, the power that you have. You feel the power that you have when you're fighting together, collectively. And you also see, it helps bring everyone's awareness up to the real, the root cause of these problems, right? And things can shift very quickly in people's consciousness. And yeah, I mean, to some degree, yeah, we all, we can become complacent, but I think, yeah, that's the importance of organizing to bridge those divides and to overcome the complacency, because people do when they're energized. We're energized by each other, right? When we're in the streets and we're organizing together in our communities, we're all lifted up, and people feel that when they do engage. So it's just, how do we reach more people, right? How do we get out more? How do we inspire more people to take action and be, and build these community connections, locally, as well as then connecting, nationally, and connecting globally. But people are doing it, and when they do it, when they engage, when they come around, when they get active, their lives are transformed in a good way. And yeah, a lot of these, things that I write about in Climate Solutions, and I mean, what I argue is that, yeah, we can't solve it under capitalism, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't fight for reforms under capitalism. We should fight for everything we can get within the system, with the long-term goal of shifting the system, right? So that we don't have to keep fighting for these crumbs from the capitalists, but actually have control of the resources, because the workers create all the wealth in society. Without the workers, the billionaires couldn't be billionaires, because they don't know how to work. Actually, they don't know how to do all the things that we do. All they know how to do is, like, yeah, I don't know, trade money on the stock market. Maybe not even that. They pay someone to do that for them too. So yeah, it's just, it takes it in one way it's very simple. People's consciousness and the way they see themselves in the world can shift very, very quickly, but it does take hard work too by those of us who are organizers to get out there and meet more people and to make these connections with folks, because people also, you know, maybe they hate the system and they want change, but they feel very isolated, right? The system is very good at keeping us isolated, like you said. And they feel very alone. And then maybe they'll see, like, oh, there's a protest in the corner in my small town. Like, what's this about? And they go and talk to people, and it's just like, when you make that one connection, it can change your whole perspective on the world, and the trajectory of where you're going with your life and how you're engaging in politics. So yeah, it just speaks to, you know, that's how I got involved. I didn't grow up at all with a radical family or class conscious family at all. But, you know, I saw a flyer for an anti-war protest in 2002 here in San Francisco, and I didn't know there were even protests still in this country, and I got involved from there, and it changed my life, and I saw hope for the future, you know. So yeah, things can happen shift very quickly at a personal level with individuals, when we come into collective action.
Having said everything that I said before, and people know, you can go watch some of the previous episodes, I will leave on an optimistic note. I do believe before the end of my life, I definitely believe that there will be an uprising from the people. And I definitely think we're going to have another revolution. And I think it's inevitable. I really do. And I think that's the tension. There is a very small, abrupt window. It doesn't take a long time, like you said. It does not take a long time. It's amazing the things that can mobilize people. I think it will be something that's quite abrupt, but I think there's also a fascination too much with the 60s. We have to have another reference point. We got to stop. That was a different time. It was 60 years ago, and we're in a different context now. And I think that the system itself is going to be the agitation that causes the revolution, because I just don't see how it's sustainable. This like I see people getting bored making money. I see people bored because they don't know what to do with themselves. You know, because there's no, in a way, it's anti-innovative, because you always hear that about the super capitalist argument is that innovation, but I see it as very anti-innovative in ways. And I like how you emphasize innovative ways into incorporating a green society, and it's something that I really never thought about before. But you also pointed out even the issues with the agricultural industry, how just it seems like every industry you look at, the climate industry. You mentioned the NGOs earlier. I mean, we have these Greta Thunberg types, and we have all these figureheads, and then you realize that they're backed by multi-billionaires and millionaires, and so the messaging, even from these same industries, are still is a compromised message from the capitalist class. And so it's like everything that it touches, it just contaminates it. And so I understand that as a leftist, like I totally get it. And so I guess the work that we have to do is to show other people that there are other possibilities. And I think you did a great job of showing those other possibilities.
Yeah, that's a big part of it, is to show that a better world is possible, right? And that we don't have to live in this, capitalist dominated world where we're begging for crumbs from the ruling class. And yeah, the NGO industrial system is really, I mean, they're beholden, what they do, they're beholden to their corporate backers or their government backers or the grants that they get. So they really have to censor themselves, even if they are against the system. They have to work within, you know, the confines of the system in whatever they're doing, because of their funding. And the PSL, we're not a nonprofit. We are self-funded, and it's the members who keep the organization going. So we're not beholden to any big funders. So we can actually act independently and put out the true politics and the true, you know, analysis of what's going on in the world and what the solutions are. So yeah, it is a big problem with the climate justice movement, that it's so it has to fit everything within the reform system, which is really a dead end.
You all do amazing work, by the way, the PSL. Like, I've read a lot of your literature. Like, I've known about the PSL for a long time. Is it only that chapters in other parts of the country, right? Because I know that I think there's one in Nashville, Tennessee, even now. But how does that work? And I didn't want to talk a lot about that today because I want the emphasis to be more so your book and not electoral politics. But as far as the PSL expanding, is that something that's in the cards later down the road, as far as like ballot access initiatives, or is that less of a concern? Because obviously it seems like it's more of a grassroots direct action type organization more than anything, and just like the literature, the education component, and not so much focus on the political suit and tie type situation.
Yeah, so we're a national organization. We have branches all over the country, in small towns, small and large cities, all across the country. I do believe we're in Nashville. I know we're in Tennessee, different parts of Tennessee. But yeah, and we do engage in electoral politics too. We've run candidates for president. We run candidates for local elections, and we don't usually, you know, generally we don't see that as like we're doing it to win, because we don't have corporate backing. We don't have the money to actually to campaign in the sense that the billionaire class does. But we do it to engage in that dialogue, in that debate, right? Because everyone's attention is on the elections at certain times, and that's a way for us to actually be in dialogue with people and talk about working class issues, right? That the two-party system never talks about. So yeah, we sort of fight on many different fronts, and part of it is electoral politics, but also, yeah, just grassroots organizing we see is really the way to build the organization and build the movement. But yeah, we of course want to reach more people and increase our membership. But you know, because I mean, the left is so small in this country. It's, you know, unfortunate. We want to build more alliances and more folks on the ground, and spreading this message and doing the work and organizing our class. But yeah, so yeah, we're always looking to expand and grow. But it's through the work on the ground, grassroots organizing.
That last point you made about the left is so small in the country. I think that's to be determined. I think we have a silent left, but I think the electoral process has killed any sort of mobilization of that left, and so I think if anything is definitely just dissolved it more into capitalism. That's exactly what it's done. And that's why, like, I have friends of all stripes, while a lot of them associated with Democrats. They've basically taken those kind of people and almost just like examine them as far as like what their views are, and somehow they've been able to concoct them all into that blue suit in some kind of special way. And it's like the people who are already like less receptive to that messaging, they already had those people on the red side, and so all they needed to do really was just find a way to break up these other elements. And we know that there have been strong programs in history, the COINTELPRO, and just all the government condemnation under that, just activists. I mean, it's so sad. I mean, the people who have done just unbelievable work, like true revolutionaries in the 60s, that I'm not going to call by name are now supporting Democrats in 2023. Like that's where the left is now. We went from radical revolutionaries with their own parties, and now we basically been dissolved into, I don't know what it is now. A lot of the people that I know who are on the left, they don't even participate in electoral politics. And myself, I'm a strategic participant, is what I call it. Been in such a red state like Tennessee, I've been more strategic about voting. But I think the messaging is way more important. I think educating is way more important. And that's why I started this, is to give voices on that can, reach out to people one by one. I think that's what we're going to have to do is just get in the streets and go to our neighbors and go to our neighborhoods and local areas and just kind of grow it from the local, because everything else is just, I don't know. I think that's the biggest part is the organizing, and then we can worry about the electoral stuff later. I totally agree with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we need to connect with each other. That's a big part of it. Really, yeah.
But Tina, I have to get a couple of kids in a little while from school.
Oh,
But
sure. Yeah.
I did want my audience to know if they had a question or comment, what would be the most effective way to reach you?
They could reach out via email to SF as in San Francisco at pslweb.org, and those messages will get to me. Just address it to me and they'll be forwarded. And if anyone, I'm always open to come and speak at, for community organizations or schools or whatever. So if anyone wants to book me for a speaking engagement, they could reach out there as well. And I write regularly on environmental and climate issues for Liberation News. So it's liberationnews.org. You can find my ongoing analysis of different environmental issues, as well as find my book there.
Absolutely. And I can talk off air as far as like the best way to link that, because I want to link everything through that, like avoid Amazon costs. So yeah, I'm going to link all that information in the description, your book information, and hopefully we can have you on down the road to discuss more of your work as well. And the PSL again does great stuff. Tina does great stuff, and we appreciate all the work that the Liberation School does, and just educating people one by one. And beautiful people, this was a great episode 35. Episode 36, we have S.L. Kenton coming on. He's going to talk a lot about India, the BRICS coalition, geopolitics, some Ukraine, Russia, not too much because we've almost exhausted that topic on this forum as it is, just having different analysts come on with their publications. But we have quite a few people. We have Cecilia Prado coming on next week to talk about unions and some of the labor movements going around the country. We have just Norm Finkelstein is coming on, Don Duke. We have just tons of activists, politically conscious people, politicians that are run for president, for local office on the forum. Make sure you subscribe to Kiko's Free Thinkers Forum on YouTube and all podcasting platforms. We had a rating of, I think we're ranked within the 250 top podcasts in Austria last month, according to Spotify statistics. We have quite an international audience. We've reached 38 different countries. So we wanted to be that way. That was the goal, to reach 100 different countries by the end of 2023. And so just spread the message, tell everyone to subscribe. We don't want your money, we want your minds so we can think together. I could care less about the money. This is like a public service as far as I'm concerned. So have a great day and we'll talk soon. Cheers.